All right. Well, Daphne, it is so nice to chat with you again. It's been, wow, probably like more than 6 months since we last talked, and Melissa and I are really pumped to talk with you. And we have been starting every episode with an icebreaker. So I was wondering, what is something that you're reading, watching, or listening to?
Okay, well, thank you guys for having me. Actually, I am reading a book right now. Oddly enough, it's a fiction book, which I haven't read probably since last summer, like a good fiction book, because everything that I read is either like self-help type stuff or nutrition or some kind of medical thing or whatever. So I don't even remember the name of it. I think the name of it is something like The House on Oyster Creek.
Cool.
Something like that. But yeah, I just got back from vacation yesterday. So I wanted to read this book, and I'm almost finished with it. It's my little vacation read.
I love it. Where were you vacationing?
I went to North Carolina.
Fun.
Yeah,
Nice.
Western North Carolina.
Very fun.
Yeah. So what am I watching? We just started watching, my husband and I are kind of watching The Lincoln Lawyer. It's good. It's something, it's a Netflix series, and that's about it.
Cool. I've heard of that, but I'm gonna definitely check it out now.
Yeah, it's it's just one of those fun things to do to pass the time in the evenings.
Yeah, love it.
Adding that to my Netflix list right now. So. Alrighty, well, let's get started then with the interview. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your health journey and what led you to where you are today?
So yeah, I am a registered dietitian because my family growing up, so I knew I wanted to be a dietitian when I was probably about somewhere between 8 and 10 years old. Wow. I knew I was going to be a dietitian, but it's because my family was always dieting. Like somebody was always on a diet. They were talking about diet food. They were, everything was all about weight loss. And I thought, well, I mean, I can do this. I already know it. This is easy. This is how I was raised, And so, so I knew I wanted to be a dietitian, and I went to just conventional school and got my bachelor's. Then I did my internship at the VA hospital and started working within hospitals. And so I worked in the VA. I worked in multiple settings in the VA. We had a nutrition staff or a dietitian staff of about 25 people. And so I was one of the multiple dietitians there. That's pretty unusual for a hospital setting. And we moved around a little bit, moved to New Orleans. And then whenever we moved to where we currently live, I told my husband, I was like, I cannot go work in a hospital again. I can't. I need to do my own, I need to set my own rules. And I'm pretty much a rule follower. I'm one that follows the rules, but there was a point when I was like, I just can't do this anymore. And so I decided to start my private practice, and I knew zero about, and when I say zero, like, I am not a business person. So I didn't really know anything about starting a private practice or what it takes to be in private practice, but I did. And that was 12 years ago. And I've stumbled along the way and learned a whole lot. And, but I'm still in business. So I feel like I've done some things right along the way. So I mostly work with people individually, but I also do cooking classes, and my goal is to help people feel confident with their body, with themselves, through the foods that they eat. And then, of course, to feel their best, physically feel their best. But I think that comes with confidence too.
Absolutely. And that is so important, especially as you acknowledged, you became a dietitian because you saw so many people, engaging in diets and diet culture. And so, getting people to that place where they feel confident in their ability to nourish themselves and feel good about themselves is absolutely incredible. And we know that you work with people who have varying degrees of metabolic disorders. And so for those of our listeners who aren't really sure what a metabolic disorder is, could you just explain what that is and some examples of metabolic disorders?
Yeah, so metabolic disorder, it just, by definition is how you metabolize food. And so the more like common metabolic disorders, diabetes or insulin resistance, or, there are lots of names that kind of fall under the umbrella of blood sugar handling. So prediabetes, impaired glucose tolerance, like I said, insulin resistance, and then kind of a sub part of that would be polycystic ovarian syndrome, thyroid dysfunction, adrenal problems, with energy levels. So that's kind of the realm of what I normally work with. And then kind of what piggybacks onto that always is if we're talking about metabolism and absorption, we always have to go with digestion and kind of understand what's happening in the GI tract. So mostly IBS is what I work with. So irritable bowel syndrome, either that or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So those are kind of the two digestive things that mostly come up with metabolic syndromes. Yeah. So, and I have my own thyroid issues. So I have Hashimoto's disease. And so that's kind of what has led me into this, this metabolic dysfunction. Between that and my dad was diagnosed with diabetes when I was in getting my bachelor's degree. And so I thought, well, I'm just gonna, solve the world of diabetes and figure all this out. And so those two things I find very fascinating, because there are things that whenever you do something, you can notice an immediate change.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's funny you say that. So like with diabetes and insulin resistance, and then I think you were saying glucose resistance, could you talk about like what the differences of all of those different forms of?
Funny you should ask. So I kind of think of them as being like you're pregnant. So if you like, it's pregnancy, you're either pregnant or you're not. If you have blood sugar handling issues, no matter if we call it prediabetes or diabetes, or you either have the problem or you don't. So you have problems with blood sugar regulation or you don't. But to be fair, there is some minute differences between the three, or between all of them. So I think probably what's most important, rather than get into the minutia of what is like what differentiates diabetes or prediabetes, I think it's more important to understand that there's two main things that we're looking at. One is glucose, which is also what we consider to be blood sugar. And then one is insulin, which helps to regulate blood sugar. So the two different things, and I think there's a lot of confusion. So you can have normal blood sugar. So when you get your blood tested by your doctor, or even if you're testing your blood sugar with a glucose meter, your blood sugar can be normal, but the amount of insulin that your body has to produce to keep your blood sugar normal may be excessive. So you may be having to produce a significant amount of insulin just to keep your blood sugar in a normal range. Or you can be creating a lot of insulin and it's still not able to keep your blood sugar normalized. So those are kind of some of the extremes. Of course, there's different types of diabetes where some people just don't produce enough insulin, and that would be either type 1 diabetes or kind of the tail end of the progressive part of type 2 diabetes, where the pancreas is just no longer able to produce insulin. But I think it's important to understand that there's glucose and there's insulin as two separate things. They obviously work very closely together, but they're two different things that can be measured and worked with.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And actually, a few years ago when I was in college, growing up, I had a lot of different like gastrointestinal issues, stomach issues. When I was younger, they told me it was stress, and then acid reflux, all the things. But then I was diagnosed with insulin resistance, and they said it was pre-diabetic. You don't have to worry about it. And they even saying like some fruits and vegetables weren't good for it. And to me, I personally think, and I was trying to do research, like, I don't know if I did it to myself, because growing up in a family where there was always different fad diets and cutting out things, like I went through the diets of cutting out every form of carb or like gluten and dairy, like all the things. So I almost thought I did it to myself, but I didn't really know the cause, and the doctor at that point in time couldn't really articulate that much. So I'm curious what your thoughts on that is.
Well, I think that, whether we're talking about blood sugar handling or insulin, both of them, collectively are lifestyle challenges or lifestyle diseases, I'll say. And by that, I mean, stress certainly is a factor. So there are four, what I would consider to be the four pillars of what's going to affect blood sugar and insulin levels. Stress is one, and that stress can be anything from like the stress, like what we consider to be stress. So stress of a deadline, stress of a family member that's ill, stress of being a caregiver, stress of being a parent. Those are types of stressors that we normally think of as stress, but also stress can be a surgery, an illness, medications can sometimes be stressors. So there's a pretty big span of what causes stress, and none of us are getting away with no stress. We all have stress to some degree, but the way that you handle that stress, or the way that you participate in stress relieving activities, is a really important part of that. So stress is one pillar. The next is sleep. Sleep is very, very important. Obviously, we all know that sleep is important, but there are so many people that are trying to either, it kind of falls into two categories. And I think about everything as quality and quantity. So perhaps your quality of sleep is not good. If you fall asleep, you wake up multiple times. You maybe because of anxiety or any number hormone issues are just having a hard time getting yourself back to sleep whenever you wake up. So that's poor quality of sleep. But quantity of sleep is whenever you're staying up till midnight and getting up at 5 or 6 a.m. just trying to get all the things done. So sleep kind of falls under that quality and quantity. And then the third pillar would be exercise or movement. So depending, all types of movement can be helpful and useful, but if I think there does need to be a balance of some resistance training to build muscle, and then some cardiovascular training to train your heart. Both of them are important. So for someone who's just going to, go for a walk 5 days a week, that is helpful, but it's not the whole picture of what's going to be useful for insulin resistance or for blood sugar handling. And then, of course, food is the other main thing that we spend a lot of time talking about. And again, I think that falls under quality and quantity too. So there's kind of both aspects of that can be honed in on.
So I don't know if you have heard of Glucose Goddess, but she's big on Instagram right now, and she just published a book, The Glucose Revolution. And so I've been scrolling through and just taking it in, and she kind of has her idea of like how you should eat to balance blood sugar and how you should kind of frame your meals. And her kind of philosophy is just, you don't have to cut anything out. It's more of like how you eat it, when you eat it, how much of what you eat. So I'm curious to know, when you work with your clients, like, are there blood sugar hacks for eating that you teach them to help them either manage or prevent these metabolic disorders?
How much time do we have? Okay, so just kidding. There's what's going to work well for a lot of people, but everybody's very individual. So whenever I'm working with someone individually, we really have to focus on where are they coming from, because I've had, just recently a few people that I'm working with that get probably 2 meals a day from fast food. Okay. So if we're coming from that, then we really just need to cut out sodas. Like, we're going to do it very, very basic. So again, I think about quality and quantity, but what we're always aiming for, one is we need to eliminate anything that's going to cause significant glycemic response, meaning make your blood sugar go up very quickly. Okay. That's going to be very concentrated sugars. So again, like sodas, even fruit juices are not going to be beneficial. Not to say that you can never have sugar, but sugar is never going to work for you. So, things that have a lot of sugar in them. So, popsicles, lollipops, candies, jelly beans, all of these like high sugar foods, those are not working for anyone. But really kind of focusing on foods that are low glycemic. And what that means is that it's not going to affect your blood sugar as much. Pairing what I consider, so I think of carbohydrates as being smart carbs. So pairing a smart carb, which is something that has things like phytochemicals, vitamins, minerals, fiber. So those smart carbs with another type of food that has either kind of protein or fat. Preferably protein, because, you know, fat can get us into a sticky area pretty quickly. Fats are important, but we need to have a lot of understanding about fats before we just dive into that. But so pairing your smart carbs with some kind of protein is really kind of the best approach to every time you're eating something. So we never want to have what we'll call a naked carbohydrate, meaning a carbohydrate just by itself. It needs to be something that's going to have that that nutrient profile. So fiber, vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, and phytochemicals are the things that will provide color to food, mostly plant-based. Phytochemicals are all plant-based. So we want to pair that with our protein. And that's kind of, if there's the underlying thing, that's what we're always moving towards. In addition to that, timing of meals can be important. And so timing wise, I think everybody needs to have at least 12 hours of fasting, so that we're from the time that you have your last thing that you're going to eat at night until the time that you have the first thing that you're going to eat or drink in the morning. We should have about a 12-hour fasting period. That's the minimum. Fasting can go in it can go in a lot of different directions, and kind of depending on what is going to work for you, we can expand on that fasting. You can do things like intermittent fasting for some people, things like a 5 and 2 day fasting where you fast, you know, for 2 days, you eat your normal kind of routine for 5 days. We could do things like the fasting mimicking diet, where it's a small amount of calories for a short period of time just to kickstart things. So fasting goes in a totally different direction and in multiple directions. But timing of meals is very important with blood sugar management also.
That's so helpful. And it's funny that you said the 12 hours of fasting, because I've read so many studies. It was something that I wrote a couple of papers on in school, that for women, it's so important to prevent breast cancer to fast for 12 to 13 hours. And it, you know, when you think about that, you're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to eat? But, you know, it's like after dinner till before breakfast is probably the easiest, right?
Right. I mean, it's not, if you just kind of count the time. So I would say in the summertime, it's probably harder just because the days are longer. And so we tend to be more active and doing things outside. And then you come inside and you're like, oh my goodness, it's 8 o'clock, you know, now I need to eat something. But really, if you put forth just a little bit of effort, you can do this pretty seamlessly. It's, you know, pretty easy. So oftentimes what it means is bumping up the time that you have your evening meal a little bit, not having any snacks or drinks in the evening, and then maybe in the morning, kind of adjusting your morning meal a little bit.
That's so helpful.
Yeah. So we do have to kind of be careful for some people. 12 hours is baseline that everyone should be doing, even if you don't have blood sugar issues. 12 hours is pretty good because it helps your body to have enough time to digest what's in your digestive system and kind of move things through. But for women who maybe have some thyroid issues, long periods of fasting may not necessarily work. So we kind of have to fine tune it and see what's going to work for each person.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I've heard mixed reviews about intermittent fasting based on the people, and that some people it works great for, and some people it has the opposite effect. So I think that makes a lot of sense the way you just explained it.
So there's not a lot of research on like gender specific or even time of life specific. So like intermittent fasting for someone who is, for like teenage girls, long periods of fasting may not necessarily be ideal. Or, you know, for pregnant women, you know, wouldn't recommend fasting at all. Or as you're kind of moving through the transition of perimenopause, menopause, long periods of fasting may or may not work. It's really, there's not been a lot of research on that specifically. Most of the intermittent fasting where you're doing long periods of fasting is done on men. Most of the research, I should say, is done on men.
That's really interesting. I think it explains it, but that's one thing I did want to ask you about earlier when you were talking about smart carbs. I'm wondering if you can give like some examples for listeners that don't know what smart carbs mean. Like, do they think it's like whole wheat bread, or is it potatoes, or even some vegetables have that like that carby? Like...
Yeah. So the umbrella of carbohydrates, the foods that fall under there is vast. There are tons of them. But what I would consider to be a smart carb is any type of bean. So black beans, lentils, garbanzo beans, those are going to be our highest fiber foods. And also the ones that are colored. So again, black beans being black, they have certain phytochemicals in them, versus kidney bean, which is red, is going to have a different set of phytochemicals in them. So beans, I would consider a smart carb. There's kind of a lot of controversy around if we should have beans or not because of the lectins and, all these different things. But I do think beans are important. They can be really useful. Also vegetables. So all of our vegetables fall under the category of carbohydrates, simply because they really don't have much protein or fat in them. And they do have a little bit of carbs. And so the carbohydrates, they kind of just fall under that umbrella. But that's going to include things like your cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts and cabbage, also to things that are more like your summer vegetables, which are tomatoes and cucumbers and zucchini and squash. The vegetables kind of run that whole gambit, and they're all what I would consider to be smart carbs. Some fruits, so of course your berries, so strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, also things like pomegranate, kiwi, grapefruit, those are all what I would consider smart carbs. And then things like the more starchy kind of things would be things like plantains, sweet potatoes, butternut squash, all of your winter squashes, acorn squash, even spaghetti squash. Those would be what I would consider your smart carbs. And then grains, grains are interesting. Some people tolerate them and some people don't. But I would say if we're talking about grains specifically, quinoa, so more of your seed type grains, quinoa, amaranth, millet, those are going to be your better ones. Brown rice. So I'm in Louisiana. If I said that you can't have rice, then people I might get booted out of the state. I think that rice can fit. Again, when we're talking about quality and quantity, quality of rice is, you would be better off with something like a brown rice, or there's like black rice and purple rice. Those are going to be, give you more of a varied nutrient profile. But those are some things that we can do in smaller portions. Just a regular amount of regular rice in smaller portions can, potentially work for some people. But quality and quantity. So those types of grains are going to be very different from rice cakes, which are, more processed, more refined, less of a nutritional value. Rice Krispies or some kind of puffed rice cereal, they're not the same thing. Yeah. So all of your smart carbs are going to be whole food based carbohydrates.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important for people to know, because I get a lot of questions about what I eat and how I'm eating for my body and whatever. And I always am like, well, eat this, and I'll get pictures of my friends and family will send me pictures of like what they pick up at the store. And they're like, oh, you said, perfect example, like rice was good. So here's this rice-based cracker that's super processed. And I'm like, yeah, it's probably better than like buttery crackers that are completely processed, but not quite what I was going for.
Right. So what I always tell people is a whole grain is something that you can look at and you can see that there's a grain there, versus a processed or refined grain. No matter what the packaging said, it started as a whole grain, but it is no longer a whole grain. So like corn is considered a whole grain. Corn chips, corn flakes are not corn tortillas. Those are no longer whole grain. Even if it says on the corn chip bag that it's multi-grain, whole grain, it's not whole grain anymore. There's not a corn chip tree, so, and I love corn chips just as much as the next person, but it's just not a whole grain.
Yeah. Call them out. Melissa, go ahead.
I did have a question about cruciferous vegetables because
Okay.
I know like I've had trouble digesting it in the past and family members, and I've heard some friends also like have trouble digesting like cauliflower and broccoli and stuff. Is that because of an underlying digestion issue, or is it just because of everyone is different with the way they can digest different types of foods?
Most of them, their nature of the vegetable can be challenging. It's a harder thing to digest. So it's common to have some difficulty. They can create some gas for some people, for some people, it's only if you eat a lot of it. For some people, just even a little bit can cause problems. So doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with your digestion. It's just different. Although sometimes if you're going to eat something like that causes some digestive issues, you can take a digestive enzyme capsule, and that might help a little bit. So, the Beano is something you can get over the counter very easily. Beano is it's basically a digestive enzyme that if you take it with beans or any other thing that gives you gas, pretty regularly or are kind of known for its gaseous properties, it can help to digest it a little bit easier.
That's good to know.
Yeah. I think that a lot of people also, when they ask me questions or listen to our show, they want to know, of course, I think that you gave such a perfect extensive list of smart carbs. And I think that's going to be so helpful when people are trying to plan meals and grocery shop. But are there anything that people should avoid? Especially, I know so many people, I mean, Melissa and I are both, in our mid-20s, and so many of our friends, including us, are starting to get diagnosed with these things, from prediabetes to PCOS to IBS, and Hashimoto's. One of my good friends just texted me asking for help with that. So are there foods that they should be avoiding or consuming less of during this process?
Well, I think that it is, it's always very specific and kind of depends on where the person's coming from. So, the things to avoid are, again, the things that are high sugar. Absolutely avoid anything that has a lot of sugar in it. And so general rule of thumb is 5 grams of sugar or less is considered a low sugar food. So anything that has 5 grams of sugar when you're looking at a label per serving or less is considered low sugar. But again, as Americans, we've gotten stuck in the rut of convenience trumps everything. So I think redefining convenience foods can be a good mental game for yourself to help understand that not all convenience foods are something that you are going to pull open and eat right out of the package, or drive through and grab right out of the store front, whatever, and be able to put into your mouth. So convenience foods can be something like canned beans. So beans, and I'm not like paid by the bean people, but beans are easy, they're easy and they're filling and they're inexpensive.
Sure.
So canned beans is a lot easier it's much more convenient than having to soak and cook beans from scratch. So some of your vegetables, when you're in the produce section of the grocery store, vegetables that are already cut and ready to go, as far as like shredded broccoli, shredded Brussels sprouts, or broccoli and cauliflower that's already cut, or carrot sticks, or these things that are already there, those make it convenient for you to be able to use them.
Yeah.
So kind of redefining what convenience foods are can go a long way in your ability to be able to plan and prepare foods for yourself that are going to nourish you rather than just fill your stomach.
That's so helpful, because I do think a lot of pushback that Melissa and I get, we both follow some pretty crazy health plans. We try to eat very healthy and work with practitioners. And people are just like, what? Like, how do you do that? How do you cook? How do you meal prep every week? How do you make yourself 3 meals a day? Like, how? And I think that those are some really helpful tips. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So I think all of this, when you're trying to change anything, I always or often will equate changing eating habits to changing your spending habits. Okay. So if you're trying to save $5,000, then we have to look at, okay, where are you spending your money? Okay. Are you spending it in, are you buying fancy food? Are you going shopping all the time? Are you dining out all the time? Are you going on vacations often? I mean, where do you spend your money? And so I think about kind of eating the same way. If we're trying to change an eating habit, then we have to look at what are your current eating habits like, and where can we shift and adjust? And everyone is going to do better long term. So, I mean, I can put you on a diet for, 28 days is kind of a standard elimination style diet. We can do it for a short period of time. Everybody can do that for a little while. But when we're talking about long-term eating changes, then you're going to be much better off just kind of making little shifts at a time. So it's going to take you a lot longer to do it, but you're going to be able to stick with those habits and those routines better. So little shifts at a time. So if you're currently not eating breakfast at all, and you feel like that's the thing that we need to bring in to help you, then let's bring in something that's super simple. Like start with something like a protein shake. It's not the greatest in the world, or, it's not always the greatest, but it's something that can kickstart your metabolism, and that might work for you. So I think that little small shifts and just thinking about how can we up level this just a little bit is going to be easier. So maybe just adding a little bit of a prepackaged salad with your meal that you normally eat the same thing, but just add some kind of vegetable to it first. So little shifts are going to be a lot easier to handle rather than trying to change everything all at once.
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts on, and I guess you're talking about like starting with protein shake. What are your thoughts on like the whole like 3 meals a day, or 3 meals, smaller meals and 2 snacks? Or like what is your input on that? Or is it everyone different?
Okay, so it's very timely that you're asking me this question, because my thoughts have changed, or my thoughts kind of are changing. So I think in general, I grew up, so I'm in my mid 40s. So I grew up in, the 80s and the 90s, whenever everything was 3 meals and 2 snacks, or 6 small meals, or, 3 small meals and 3 small snacks. And what we know is that, first off, that didn't work because everybody got bigger. So the definition of what is a small meal is very different for everybody. So it's really hard to gauge that, and really hard to make those changes, because our culture, our American culture, is that our meals are big. And, where that started, that's a whole nother area of conversation, but we eat big meals. And so to change that culturally is difficult. Not to say that it can't be done and that it doesn't work for some people, it can, but generally that's going to cause you to increase the amount of food that you're eating. So I think that shifting, I don't think that we need more than 3 meals. However, kind of my rule of thumb is that a meal should last you for about 4 to 6 hours. So you should be able to go, if you eat something and then you're hungry, you eat something at 10 o'clock and you're hungry at 12:30, that's only 2.5 hour time span. So we have to look at that meal and say, okay, what was it about that meal that didn't hold you over to at least 4 hours? Usually it's because there's not enough protein or fat in there. So if you think about when you've had a bowl of cereal, or a couple of slices of toast as a meal, that's just, it's all carbohydrates, and it just doesn't keep you full long enough. So 4 to 6 hours is the standard. If you're going to have lunch at noon, and you know that you're going out to dinner with somebody at 8 o'clock, or you know that your next meal is not going to be until much later, then a snack might be needed to keep you from really overdoing it at that next meal. So snacks can be useful. They're not necessary. They're not 100% necessary. So if we're looking at a 12-hour time span of eating, so if we're fasting for 12 hours and we've got 12 hours in the day that we can eat, then if our meals are appropriately planned, we can interject, 3 meals in there, and we should be okay. Now, for the sake of, and we talked about fasting a little bit earlier, for the sake of how many meals do we need, that I think remains to be seen. And I think it's a little bit different for everyone. So we know research has shown that calorie restriction, decreased calorie intake, is more beneficial for longevity, for cancer reduction, and for some people, a lot of people, that blood sugar and insulin balance. So lowering the amount of calories that we eat is, and of course for weight, is helpful. The way that you structure those can be different for each person, but also it can be different from day to day. So, it's not that we have to have one mode of eating and it has to be that 7 days a week all the time. It can be changed up where, like I mentioned, the 5 and 2, where you do 5 days of your normal kind of eating patterns, 2 days of fasting, which can be either just much, much, much smaller meals, or it can be, some people will do a water fast where they're not having anything for that full 24-hour time period. So I think it's different for every person. And it's, I think, more of a mental state that we get in than a physical state. There are not, in our American culture, most of us are not going to go hungry. Now, that doesn't, I recognize that there's definitely a subset of population that hunger and putting food on the table is an issue. And I don't want to make light of that, but we have food access everywhere we go. And so most of us are not going to go hungry. The challenge generally is finding what is going to work for you on a day-to-day basis. And that's where I think working with someone who has some kind of insight into just a different way of doing things from what your norm is, because sometimes whenever we're in it, we don't even think that there's another way. It's hard to come up with, oh, well, maybe I should change my timing of meals, so I think working with someone on the outside can be helpful to kind of reevaluate the way that you're structuring your meals.
Totally. And you are like setting me up for this question I've been dying to ask you, because I live in Texas and I have a lot of friends and family members who are just so like, this is what we make. This is our tradition. This is how we cook it. This is what we have for dinner. This is what we have for lunch. This is what we make on holidays. And it's tough when I'm like, we can still have similar dishes or dishes with the same spirit, but we can modify them to make them a little bit healthier. And so I'm curious how you navigate this with your clients when you're, to your point, like there is so much access to unhealthy foods or, what you're used to. So how do you navigate this when you're working with clients?
Well, I'll just say that if I had all the answers, I would not be here. I would be on a beach in Fiji somewhere, because that's like the golden question. So I think, again, quality and quantity are the two things that I always fall back on. So we can either change the quality of the food. So what I mean by that is here in South Louisiana, we have things like gumbo and etouffee and jambalaya. A lot of foods that are rooted in a lot of culture here, and people are generally not willing to give it up. So we can either change the quality. So depending on what somebody's challenges are, maybe changing to like a gluten-free roux, which is going to make some of these foods, is going to decrease your inflammation. So something like that that's just a small example of how we can change the quality. Or we can change, and if we're just to that point, we can, we have 4th of July coming up. Burgers and hot dogs are the king, I think, that's the American way on 4th of July. So we can do something like a chicken patty rather than, or even improving the quality of the beef. So maybe using a grass-fed beef or a lower fat based beef. So instead of doing like an 80-20 beef, doing more like a 90-10. So there's just less fat in it. Maybe you would do it without a bun, because we know that there's no bun tree where buns are falling off of the tree. We know that those are refined foods. So maybe doing it without a bun and maybe some sauteed or grilled vegetables with it. So we're still able to have the grill. We're still able to have our hamburger. There's not much I can say for hot dogs. I mean, the only way to improve a hot dog is to just not eat it. That's how I feel. But, we can, there are ways to change the culture a little bit, maybe having like a fruit salad as part of the meal that would be brought over rather than other types of chips and dip type things. So we can still enjoy the culture, we can enjoy the foods, but to a smaller extent. Or it could be something like potato salad. My brother-in-law makes the best potato salad on the planet, and I don't even like potato salad, but if he brought it, then I'm gonna eat it. Not a ton, I'll have enough, like probably a good serving spoonful, but that would mean if I'm going to have potato salad, maybe I'm not going to have, those corn chips that I also adore. So, it's really kind of picking and choosing and determining what the portions are, how can we upgrade how it's being made, and also our food choices tend to lead us to very large portions. And so having a taste of something is totally fine, as long as you're being aware of everything else that's going into it. An eating frenzy at a 4th of July barbecue from 12 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the afternoon is really, that's kind of where part of that problem is going to come from too.
Absolutely.
So I know Kath wanted to talk about PCOS. So I'm just gonna bring it up now. So we saw that you have a PCOS meal plan on your website, and many of our listeners are impacted by PCOS. Could you talk about some dietary changes that could help with that, or any recommendations for our listeners if they are struggling with this?
So first, I'll say that PCOS it's a very broad diagnosis, and there's a lot of, from the medical field, a lot of questions that have not been answered yet. So we know generally that PCOS is an elevation in testosterone. It usually has accompanied with it, at least to some extent, some insulin resistance going along with it. And those two, testosterone and insulin, work together to create a diagnosis of PCOS. So as far as a meal plan, what we're working on is how can we decrease testosterone and how can we manage or lower insulin resistance. So from the testosterone standpoint, things like spearmint tea can be really helpful. So spearmint, not peppermint. The research was done on spearmint tea. Things like omega-3 fatty acids. So that's going to be found, of course, you can supplement with it, but also in things like salmon and tuna and sardines, if you're brave enough to dive into sardines or anchovies. So those are really good omega-3 sources. Also, from a plant-based side, things like chia seeds and walnuts can be good omega-3 sources. So your omega-3s are going to be really helpful with that. And then from the insulin standpoint, again, it's kind of the same principles that we would follow for people with blood sugar handling issues: smart carbs in small amounts paired with protein and healthy fat. And then timing, we can play with timing of meals for that from that perspective also. I will say from a medical perspective with PCOS, getting your insulin level checked, so not your blood sugar, but finding out what your insulin number is a good measure. It's a good kind of measuring stick of how you're making progress. So if your insulin level when you get started is 45, and then you implement changes, and insulin levels change a lot, I definitely understand that. But after you make some changes, if your insulin level comes down to 23, then we know that we're moving in the right direction. But it's not often tested.
What is considered a normal insulin level?
Okay, so there's reference range. So if you go get your labs done, the reference range for insulin is anywhere from like 3 to like 25 or 27, depending on the lab. So it's usually in that upper 20s. The optimal range is 9 or less. So 3 to 9 would be kind of the optimal range for insulin.
Is this, so I've in school been doing research on this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is that because as Americans, we've become so unhealthy that this reference range is larger and the optimal range isn't necessarily what is shown up on labs? Or is it just that if you're in this, reference range, like your life shouldn't be too impacted by it, but it's still not optimal? Because I know a lot of people who go to the doctor and are like, there's something wrong, but they're like, oh no, you fall into this normal range. They're like, but no. And then later they find, oh, but I wasn't optimal.
Right. So the reference range for most labs is, and this is, I'm not a lab technician, but for most labs, the reference range is found by testing a certain number of thousands of people. So I'll just use an example of 5,000 people. Okay. So we test 5,000 people's, in this case, insulin numbers, and we come up with the, what the norm is for those 5,000 people. That doesn't necessarily mean that those 5,000 people didn't have problems with managing their insulin levels. So we can just go randomly pick 5,000 people, come up with what the norm is. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's where you're going to function at your most optimal level. So reference range in many cases is a lot wider than where you're going to be optimal and where your body is going to thrive optimally from a numbers perspective.
Are there similar ranges for blood glucose levels too that you would recommend versus
so for glucose levels, it's usually pretty, so the reference range for glucose for a fasting glucose is for anywhere from 70 to 99. So that's kind of where the goal is. So from a diagnostic standpoint, any blood sugar from it's either 99 or 100, I can't remember, but the blood sugar from 101 to 125 as a fasting number would be considered prediabetes. And then 126 or above fasting is considered diabetes. So that's kind of the diagnostic criteria. I think that just in general, blood sugars, we know, alternate. They fluctuate quite a bit. So your blood sugar, you can test your blood sugar, 10 times in a day, and it's generally speaking, it's going to be a different number all of the time. So keeping glucose under 100 is ideal. And then if you're going to be doing some testing around meals, these are the kind of the guidelines that I go by. A meal shouldn't raise your blood sugar more than about 30 points. So if you're testing and you're fasting and your blood sugar is, let's say, 85, and you test after your meal, 2 hours after your meal, you have that 85 to 115 range to say, okay, if you go up to 115, then we know that meal is probably working for you. If you go up to, generally speaking, the reference range would be anything less than 140 would be considered normal after a meal. But if you start out with a blood sugar of, let's say, 75 and you go up to 140, then that's still a pretty big swing in blood sugar. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but from the standpoint of when you go get your labs drawn, anything less than 100 or 99 is considered normal for a fasting blood sugar. And that's really, the more you get to that 70 to 80 number, the more ideal it's going to be. We don't want to go too low because there's a whole nother side of blood sugar being too low that can be problematic too. But, so in this case, anything less than 100 is what the reference range says, but also what the optimal range is too.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was actually going to ask what happens if the blood sugar goes too low.
So if it goes too low, then we can have what would be considered hypoglycemia. So hypo meaning low, and it can cause a whole set of symptoms, anything from shakiness or jittery feeling or a little bit of anxiety to being very sleepy. It can create the feeling of hunger or low blood sugar or headaches. Headaches happen whenever oftentimes whenever your blood sugar starts to dip a little bit. And so sometimes that can happen when you're skipping meals. So, there's a lot of dynamic that we have to play around with for somebody who might want to do fasting type things. But it can affect vision. And so I mentioned at the beginning that my dad was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and that was in 1997. So he's had it for a really long time, and he's on insulin now. And he'll tell me all the time that if his blood sugar starts to get too low, he can see that there is a person, but he can't make out details of their face. And so it can affect your vision. Sometimes people will see like spots. So those would be some of the symptoms of hypoglycemia, or that blood sugar that starts to get below 70.
Something that I know that we were curious about, because I, on my health journey, have just started to realize that I might have some type of blood sugar or insulin imbalance. And obviously I haven't been diagnosed, but like a lot of the symptoms that I'm finding do align to PCOS. And some of them are high testosterone, like bad PMS, and some other things. And so I was wondering, for listeners who are curious if they could have a metabolic disorder, like what are some signs and symptoms that sometimes are normalized in our society, like bad PMS for one, that some people might want to just like keep their eyes out on, or maybe get a test to see if it might be a metabolic disorder?
Well, I think that it's important as a person to recognize that you are your biggest health advocate. So knowing, nobody knows the way that your body works better than you do. So even if you go to a doctor and they say, oh no, all of your numbers are fine, but you know that something is not right, then it's time to find a different doctor or find somebody that will listen to you. So as far as some big red flags would be fatigue, a lot of fatigue. A lot of people will say, I'm just tired because I didn't sleep last night, or, because I'm really stressed out or whatever. But if you are feeling like, if you're not waking up in the morning and feeling like, okay, I'm ready to start the day, then we need to look into what's going on. So fatigue is a big one. Headaches, and like having even anything from just a dull headache to something that's more severe, where you're like, you need to lay down because your head is throbbing so hard, or, even into migraine. So headaches would be a big thing to really pay attention to. Unexplained weight gain, which, that's kind of, a lot of people would say, everybody that I talk to says, I eat really healthy. Like, okay, well, let's see what that means to you, because it can mean different to different people. But, unexplained weight gain would be something to look at. And let's see what else. A lot of pain. So if we're talking about around the menstrual cycle, incredibly painful menstrual cycles where you're getting a lot of cramping, a lot of back pain, that's not normal. So, you should be able to feel it. It's not uncommon to feel it, but if you're having some debilitating pain, then that's something to really look into.
That's helpful. Yeah. Cause that's what caused me to start seeing somebody, because I was like, okay, yeah, like this isn't normal. Even when I would ask my doctor, like, oh, is this normal? And they're like, oh yeah, tons of women experience this. It's fine. And you're right. You have to be your own advocate, because I was like, this can't be fine. Like,
yeah. Well, and so there's a big difference between something being common and something being normal. So just because other people are experiencing it and it's a common thing doesn't mean that it's normal. Another one that I didn't mention would be skipping cycles. So skipping a period. So that's another one where you're not on a regular, like your regular cycle would be kind of another red flag. But yeah, just because something is common and, everybody that walks through the doctor's door, 50% of the people that walk through the doctor's door have this symptom, doesn't mean that it's a normal symptom to have. Because remember that people only go to the doctor when something is wrong.
Right.
We're not just, most people aren't just like strolling in there because they feel great and everything's going well. They're going when there's a problem.
Totally.
Yeah, and I feel like we've just normalized those problems, so people don't know when they're back at the balance level and what actually is a problem anymore.
Right. Absolutely.
So we only have a few more minutes with you. I'm so sad and have no idea how this conversation has zoomed by. And I feel bad. I was curious a little bit about your Hashimoto's journey and how you've been able to manage that. But I feel like one of our wrap up questions can kind of play into that, which is, what's one piece of advice you'd give someone starting their health journey today?
I have to choose one. I would say be kind to yourself, because it's not a straightforward path. Things are going to change and things will get you off of your journey. But knowing that you can get right back on, it's always your choice, to be able to decide, yes, I've fallen off, but I can get right back on and I can continue moving in the right direction. So definitely be kind to yourself and know that it's never, ever, ever going to be perfect. So if you're looking and you're striving to go through a health journey and expecting perfection, you're setting yourself up for failure.
I love that. Yeah, same. That's a lesson I've definitely had to learn over the past few years. So I think that's really helpful for people to know. So what do you think the future of health looks like?
Oh dear. Well, I'll say that I have been in my practice, like I said, for 12 years. I've been a dietitian for over 20 years, and I have seen things change just in the time that I'm here. Namely, like speaking specifically about nutrition. When I started, nutrition was like, nobody cares, like eat what you want. And I've had, and still, I mean, this still happens, have doctors say, okay, now you've been diagnosed, I'm diagnosing you with diabetes, eat what you want, just eat a little less of it, which I would argue is medical malpractice, but that's neither here nor there. I think that the way that from a nutrition perspective, there's been a lot more respect towards nutrition and towards what we're putting in our body over a long period of time. So just and since I've been in my practice for the past 10 years, I've seen a big change in the understanding that what you actually are putting in your body is going to affect the way that your body functions. So for a long time, that was not the case. So with that being said, I think there's a lot more emphasis on nutrition and on nutrients now than there ever has been in the past. As far as the way that the health journey is going, there's been a huge change with insurance and the way that the things that are being covered under insurance. I really feel like I don't know what the future looks like, but we're moving more, people are relying less on what insurance will cover, and they're going and spending their good hard-earned money, even though they are paying for insurance, to seek help elsewhere. So everything from acupuncture to energy healing, chiropractors now I think are mostly covered by insurance, but seeking things that are outside of the traditional medical model, because unfortunately, it's not really working the way that it's structured, and to change it takes decades. So, I think that people are realizing, one, that they do have more control over their health in general. The earlier you start, the easier it's going to be to impact the way that things go. And, we have to sometimes seek help outside of our traditional conventional doctor.
It's so funny that you say that. Everything that you were saying, I was like, yep, I can relate. Even I ended up switching nutrition programs, and the one that I was originally in, one red flag for me was they were like, what's a healthy, balanced meal? And it was a slice of Hawaiian pizza, because you get all the food groups in there. And I was like, I don't know if this is the program for me. So I ended up switching, and I'm in one that I feel more aligned to. So hoping that, teachings like that are starting to change. And I know so many people, to your point, that are reaching out to dietitians like you, to acupuncturists, to energy healers, and all of those things, because things are changing. And we want you to be one of the people that our listeners reach out to. So since this is connecting the dots, could you please tell them how they can connect with you and where they can follow you on social media?
So social media. So I have a website if you're looking for like more information specifically about me or about my programs. My website is theunconventionaldietitian.com, and that same, The Unconventional Dietitian, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook.
Yay. Yeah, we definitely want to be sending anyone your way. And so you work individually, but also you do cooking classes in Louisiana, or are they virtual? How are you structuring all of that?
So they're in Louisiana right now. I do cooking classes out of a cooking school or a kitchen store, which has like a cooking school kind of thing with it for the layperson in Baton Rouge. And I have had my own personal cooking classes kind of on pause since COVID stuff, but my plan is in the fall to restart those cooking classes. So right now everything's in person. I haven't quite figured out how to do the virtual thing. So perhaps that's something down the line, but right now everything's still in person.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank y'all so much for having me. This has been fun.
Yeah, this has been an awesome conversation. I took some notes to some action items for me and to share with my family later on today. So I think this is great.
I'm sure that my family, everybody is happy for me to talk about this in places that are not like my kitchen, because they get so tired of hearing about it. So I'm happy to be able to have another place to share information.
Yeah, we love it. We appreciate it. I will be getting spearmint tea today. So
2 cups a day. 2 cups a day.
2 cups a day. You got it. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you and all of your advice. And I know that you're making such a big impact because there are too many people dealing with metabolic disorders right now.
Yes. Yes. And it's controllable. So thank you.
Thank you.